Hello, everyone. We're going to kick things off. Welcome. My name is Benjamin Bolton. I'm head of Europe at Teradoo. And just quickly, for those who might not be familiar with our work, Teradoo is building the world's largest platform for climate learning and green skills development. And our mission, our bold mission, is to get 100 million people working in climate this decade. And that includes, upskilling employees to help organizations bridge the green skills gap and accelerate sustainability transformation. So firstly, a massive thank you to Saif for partnering with us on this event, especially so close to the festive break. We really appreciate it. We are genuinely very fortunate to have Saif share his insights with us today. And quickly before I introduce him and we dive into the conversation, I'm excited to share that today's event is actually the third in a new series that we have launched, which is featuring change makers, both within organizations that are kind of leading climate education, employee engagement initiatives, but also with peer organizations that are working with their clients on these issues as well. And the intention is really to kind of create a community around these initiatives so we can learn, share, and inspire each other. And that's why I'm really excited to dig into everything that you've learned this year, Saif, with your clients as well. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Saif. So Saif Hameed is the founder and CEO of Altruistiq. Saif has well over 20 years of experience in sustainability, and his focus is really on greenhouse gas emissions data management, and I'm sure we'll kind of dig into that. Saif's career began with a waste management nonprofit in Pakistan and led to a role as special advisor of the government of Pakistan in climate response and renewable energy. He was previously an associate partner at McKinsey's sustainability practice, where he he's also co-founded an agricultural business and environmental nonprofit. At McKinsey, Saif contributed significantly to their sustainability practice, assisting organizations with their environmental strategy and operational transformation. So this is very much in your wheelhouse for many years now, and clearly is underpinned by a deep commitment to environmental activism and sustainability. So we're really delighted to have you with us. And before we kind of dig into things and reflections from 2023, you did just come back from a very important event. So you attended COP28. And for those of us that didn't, perhaps, we would love to kind of pick your brains on it. So could you share, what are some of your key takeaways from COP28? And for those driving sustainability transformation, how might this impact, organizations in 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. First of all, just want to say very happy to be here, very excited to be collaborating with Terra as well. Have had a great experience working with Terra in other contexts also, and obviously have come to know you well over the last few years also. Maybe just to start with COP, I think what we're seeing is that COP has a bit of a lag effect versus the rest of the world, where it used to be the case that COP would kind of define a higher level benchmark than what the world was operating towards. And then everyone would scramble to figure out how to meet this benchmark. And the Paris Agreement is one good example, came out of a COP, and we were all kind of still, in many ways, still struggling to meet the benchmark. Whereas now I feel at least that most COPs are just reflecting the world as we find it. And so a couple of examples. If you look at the big announcements coming out of COP, one of them is, of course, around oil and gas industry phase down, phase out, whatever you want to call it, just equitable and orderly transition, however you want to frame this. Whereas, to be honest, I think that most people clued up on this topic would already say that fossil fuels are in some form of phase down on the way up to 2050. I don't think there are any of us that actually believe that fossil fuels are ramping up towards 2050. We're all kind of already expecting some element of phase down. So for the global community of countries to acknowledge that in writing actually doesn't, in my mind, add much. It's interesting that they've resolved or resigned themselves despite 2,500 lobbyists, or I forget what the number was, but 2,500 lobbyists descending on the COP pavilions in the blue zone, effectively as delegates. Despite all of that horsepower, you still end up with the actual agreement reflecting the status quo. Like, that's a win, I guess, but it's not news, I think. The second is, if you look at the big declarations from the oil and gas industry, specifically around methane, and let's say their scope 1 and 2 emissions particularly. I was working with a large oil and gas producer 7 years ago on controlling their flaring and fugitives. And it was not an innovative topic. It was a business as usual topic because, frankly, most of these are correlated with value. Just for anyone who hasn't worked in the oil and gas industry, my compliments. And beyond that, also, if you just think about what flaring and fugitive emissions, which drive a lot of methane emissions, are, it's basically fugitives is the stuff that leaks away. So as part of your processing and extraction of the oil and gas, you might have some gas that just leaks, basically. Could be a leak in a pipeline, it could be a leak in a compressor or a pump, and that's out of the system, which means you can't sell it. So it's got a straight up correlation with dollars as well, which means it's in the interest of the oil and gas company to control or restrict that, not just to control its emissions, but also because it's correlated to revenue and profit. The second, which is flaring, you have two types of flaring. One is unplanned and the other is planned. And both of them effectively mean that you're burning excess fossil fuels because for whatever reason, you're unable to process it. Either you had a failure somewhere else in the system, or for whatever reason, you can't process it. Again, a straight up correlation with dollars, revenue, and profit. And so for the oil and gas industry to say, look, we're committed to reducing methane emissions from flaring and fugitives is not really new, I would say. And that doesn't mean it's not a good thing. It is a great thing. It's phenomenal. It's fantastic. At the same time, it is a business as usual trajectory, in my view. The other big announcement, I think, is when you look at all the money going into climate. So I think it's $20 billion, I think, is the UAE commitment to renewable energy, primarily in climate-related infrastructure investment. Whereas renewable energy is an investable theme around the world already right now. And frankly, if you speak with most investment funds and most banks, they have a shortage in investable projects, actually. They would love to have more projects that they could deploy capital in. The shortage is not the availability of capital. And so again, I don't think that that's necessarily new. I think that COP is basically codifying a lot of what is already out there. If you look at what would be new, I would say that anything meaningful in supporting transition for the global south would be meaningful. I didn't see that much of it. If you look at something more substantive on the non-oil and gas parts of the problem, let's talk about fashion, let's talk about food. I think we've seen some indications, but most of that has been private sector. The Dairy Methane Action Alliance is really a good example, but private sector led. Whereas those areas seem to be more or less neglected for most of the actual COP debate. So if I waxed lyrical for a few minutes there, but if I was to summarize, I would say some amazing, fantastic announcements, more or less reflecting business as usual. Some good momentum from the private sector on stuff like the DMAA, but really no game-changing moves as far as I can see it versus the status quo.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that. So I would like to kind of switch gears a little bit. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Altruistiq have a brilliant podcast and content series they run called The State of Sustainability. And you recently had a whole episode which is all about building an effective sustainability team, which I recommend those attending check out. And within that episode, you mentioned a model that McKinsey have for successfully implementing effective change. So, if it's okay with you, I thought maybe we could use that almost to frame this conversation a bit. And specifically, there are 4 pillars within that report that need to come together to enable change. And in this case, we're talking about sustainability transformation. They are internal understanding and conviction, reinforcement of behavior through formal mechanisms, developing skills and talent, and role modeling. So perhaps, using this as a bit of a guide and maybe digging into the first pillar. So building understanding and conviction for kind of why the change is happening. When we talk about sustainability transformation, people often mention, it's really important to kind of win the hearts and minds of stakeholders, and specifically, employees through a lot of the work that we do is kind of the lens that we see. So what challenges do you or do your clients typically face in communicating kind of the why behind sustainability and creating kind of that conviction with their key stakeholders?
Yeah, I think that there's probably 3 elements within that, I think. And I think the first is kind of common knowledge, which is the simple knowledge transfer element. If you look at the emission space as one example, most corporate stakeholders will be familiar with scope 1, 2, and 3 as a framing, but very few of them will understand actually what sits beneath that and what's involved, what types of data, but also what types of actions and interventions they could deploy to drive change. And so I think that the first element is simply around just knowledge transfer. And we're seeing a big delta on that on carbon. But if you look at other environmental metrics, for instance, it's just bigger. If you look at regen ag, even at an organizational level, there's very little consensus between companies. And there's a lot of work going around to try and standardize that. But to have some sort of equal information within an organization of what you're solving for is typically quite hard. I was speaking with a chief procurement officer at a big personal care company just a few hours ago, and he said that unless you can actually align information behind an economic incentive, all you end up with is a great big huge group hug. And I think there's a real risk that that's kind of where we fall. The second aspect I would look into is some form of causality, because as an individual, it's very easy to see this as a problem. See, let's say climate change as a problem where your actions don't actually link up to anything meaningful. And if you think about, let's say, a procurement team in an organization where you have an individual buyer, and the individual buyer is now engaging with multiple sellers selling you, let's say, dairy products or packaging or whatever it might be, an individual buyer will have a number of accounts that they're related to. And for you to be able to move on, let's say, your scope 3 or supply chain related emissions, the individual buyer in the organization buying those products needs to understand that what they're doing is important. And they need to now be able to have a conversation where they can convince someone selling them a product that it is no longer about quality, price, volume, timing. It is now also about sustainability and how that individual stock keeping unit being sold can drive a bigger picture action. That's really difficult. And I don't think we're anywhere near getting to that level of depth in most organizations that I've seen. If I think about the third one, it's prioritization, which is, as any individual in a company has a million different priorities, the way that you distinguish them is you identify which ones are most closely linked to your compensation. And either you can manage to dovetail that in with OKRs or KPIs or whatever your framework is, but that's how things get filtered. And that leans into one of the other pillars of this influence model. But I think that idea of how to prioritize is an important aspect of the understanding and conviction as well.
And how does the work that you do, like, how does it help companies develop that internal understanding and conviction? Because it really seems like data has just such a critical role to play in that kind of storytelling, if you will. I wondered if you could maybe share a few examples.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so one thing that we did quite early is we very quickly started moving beyond the terminology of scope 1, 2, and 3 in the carbon context. And for anyone familiar with the origins of scope 1, 2, and 3, the whole greenhouse gas protocol really evolved as a way to think about carbon budgets at the level of countries. It was not intended for individual companies. It was a country-centric approach. And within countries, for you to be able to think about industries like the oil and gas industry, the packaging industry, the steel industry, etc. And in that context, scope 1, 2, and 3 start to make a little more sense. At some point, we started using it in a business context, and actually it just totally broke down because scope 3 is 90% or more in many cases of the emissions of a company, which renders scope 1 and 2 irrelevant, more or less, especially in Europe, which is rapidly decarbonizing. And so in many industries now, you're in the position where scope 1 and 2 is less than 1% in many companies that we work with, which means that the whole structure is a big other column, which is very hard to build understanding and conviction around. And so in our company, we very early on started talking about activities, and we then manage on our side the correlation of activities to scopes. So we map, let's say, utility, energy use, water, products and packaging. We map these things against the greenhouse protocol in our platform, but the user experience should be shaped and driven by business activities that actually map to the logic of how the individual within the company thinks about this. The other aspect that we tried to focus on is democratization of access to data. And so we avoided, for instance, user-based pricing very early on. And we do no user-based pricing at all, because ultimately we want hundreds of users to be able to access the platform and to be able to engage, because if you can engage people from the data level onwards and keep that continuity of engagement from someone who's putting in data to the actual action, because the person putting in logistics data today in the organization, the one who owns that data, is very often the person who's responsible for driving logistics performance as well. The person owning, let's say, utilities data is very often a facility manager who's also responsible for driving energy efficiency. And so if you can actually loop in those people at the early stage in the data gathering piece and actually keep them as a user of the platform all the way through to when they're actually building their interventions into the platform, that allows you to actually create an ambassador through what is otherwise a transactional process of getting data. So those are probably the two biggest innovations that we.
And maybe kind of focusing on the second piece a bit more. So kind of reinforcing new behaviors through formal mechanisms. So, I mean, we see when, helping organizations, integrate, implement new processes to drive sustainability, are there kind of specific challenges that you encounter, with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think that if you, the answer is almost on a spectrum if you think about size of the organization and the potential for impact. And so if you take a small organization with maybe a few hundred people, and we have several customers that are of that size, you can actually get action moving pretty quickly, because the whole sort of process of creating conviction and understanding through to driving action can be a few interaction points away, really. Let's say it's an organization with 9 warehouses, and you have a very simple process within those 9 warehouses, and those 9 warehouses are responsible for, let's say, 10,000 tons of emissions, primarily coming from, let's say, a bit of energy use, a bit of logistics, a few other things. And you might have 9 individuals there, and those 9 individuals can already run a simple process to optimize packaging being used, or optimize a production process lineup, or optimize how waste is treated at those 9 locations. You can actually find that within a matter of months, you could potentially reach a 10-15% emissions reduction just within that context through a very small set of interaction points. At the same time, if you want to actually make an impact in a much larger organization, and some of our customers have tens of thousands of people within the business at a global scale, 50,000 people plus in some situations, it's not just that reaching the point at which impact occurs is an arduous, time-consuming process. So think of that buyer that I mentioned. There might be 1,000 buyers in a procurement team, and you need to find a way to now engage all those 1,000 buyers to move the needle on procurement. And so for us as a solution provider or a platform partner, we need to think about how do we manage to engage those people at scale and also consistently. Because one thing is, can we actually have a touch point with 1,000 people? Another is, can we actually have 10 touch points with them over the course of a year? And a touch point could be something in the platform, it could be outside, it could be various aspects. And we need to have that maybe over 1, 2, 3 years to be able to actually move the needle. But when the needle moves, it'll move in a very big way. And so I think there's a bit of that trade-off. And you could also argue some organizations are very well placed to do one or other of those two problem sets. We're trying to do both. And that's because we take a very value chain oriented approach. So we want to work with the smaller farm, but also the larger processor and the even larger brand, for instance. But it's a design choice, I think, that all partners really in this space to corporates are trying.
What do you think is working in terms of, like, are you able, other examples you can share of how Altruistiq has kind of been effective in helping its clients kind of successfully overcome these challenges to integrate sustainability?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one aspect is, if I take the example, let's say, of large companies, Fortune 500 consumer companies, where you might have hundreds of different products and thousands of different stock keeping units. One of our customers, about 3 weeks ago, we generated 6,500 product snapshots. And what that is it's a snapshot in time of a specific SKU, a specific stock keeping unit, and what that looks like in emissions impact at the level of individual ingredient contributors and individual suppliers. And the company can then compare that snapshot potentially versus another snapshot in time. And if you think about the category of user that opens up, it moves from being a user that is focused on reporting to a user that is focused on product R&D, because that then is useful for someone who's redesigning the product and trying to think about a packaging trade-off. And I think that's the shift that we're trying to architect or be part of, which is we want to move beyond the sustainability reporting team to ideally two categories of user. One is those who are redesigning the product, and the other is those who are engaging with suppliers, because those are the two nodes, and they're closely related, that we think will really drive change. Realistically, I think that if we were to even catalyze 1 or 2% emissions reduction over the next 18 months across our customers, given the scale at which our customers operate, that 1 or 2% could already be, removing 1 million tons of emissions in terms of reductions. So there's a big upside based on just what you can do incrementally.
So just quickly moving on to the third pillar, which was kind of developing talent and skills. Obviously, this is one that we're particularly interested in terms of the work we do at Terra. Obviously, is an essential part of implementing, adopting any new process. So could you maybe speak about like what role do you think education upskilling can play in empowering companies to achieve their sustainability goals? And then also, how does Altruistiq facilitate this? So when you're kind of building capacity within organizations, how does Altruistiq kind of help its clients develop that knowledge and the skills that they need?
Yeah, for sure. Maybe just to start with the first, I think that if I look at two models, one model is that you take a sustainability person and you give them the skills that they lack. And the other is you take a person with other skills and you give them the sustainability context that they lack. And I think that both of these approaches can both need to run in parallel, frankly. I think if I look at the skills that sustainability people tend to have already, and I'm reflecting on, let's say, individuals who might have spent 5 years working in the broader sustainability, CSR, ESG sort of space, they will tend to be good at telling a narrative. They'll be good communicators. They'll be good at building consensus, good at stakeholder management, and they'll understand the context of the topic. So they'll understand what's important and how to think about it and how to structure it and prioritize within it. The areas where I find they tend to be weaker are typically threefold. One is anything related to anything commercial. And so usually if you kind of want these people to now go and drive a procurement conversation, or even let's say build a business case for an intervention, that is often a skill area which hasn't been historically part of this role, because it's been something very much siloed from the core business, whereas now the business wants to integrate it into the core operations. And if you think about how a business prioritizes projects or resources, it's usually on the basis of a business case of some sort. And so now you need this person to be able to develop that. A second area where I often find there's a skill gap for that sort of person is typically around project management, because usually, again, this person has been in some form of silo, and the main project that they were delivering on was either a reporting challenge, so there's a reporting deadline and you need to work towards this, or often an outsourced CSR project. So they're working with a third-party nonprofit on delivering something, and the implementation is covered by the nonprofit. And what this person is doing is kind of program management, which is a little different in some ways than project management. It's a bit more long-term, a bit higher level. And the third area, I think, is anything to do with data, IT, and kind of data systems. And increasingly, for most sustainability professionals, they're getting bogged down in data challenges. And having the ability to step back and kind of architect a system and flows of data in and data out and requirements and quality control and these sorts of things is a new skill area for this sort of individual. And so it's kind of say that like some way to maybe take those three areas and kind of upskill a sustainability professional onto those, I think is super useful. The converse of that is also true, which is if you look at individuals coming from those parts of the business, so anyone, let's say, moving in from a procurement function with good business logic, or anyone moving in from IT or like the data side with good understanding of those areas, or anyone moving through to the arms of the business that have historically focused on project implementation, like ops, for instance, and being able to give them a good, even a generalist understanding of sustainability, but even better, a role specific understanding. So if they're now moving in from procurement and they're going to be running supply chain transition for sustainability, then the generalist understanding, like what is greenhouse gas inventory, what is a science-based target, but then also the specific piece, which is what matters for suppliers. How do you have an effective win-win conversation with a supplier where you're asking them to do more, but you're also going to put something on the table so that everyone wins. There are a lot of specific aspects also to build in. I'm just going to pause there, Ben, and then I'm also happy to pick up your second part of the question on how we play into this as Altruistiq.
Yeah, I would love to hear, if there are examples of, maybe any initiatives or programs that Altruistiq is, implemented to, enhance the knowledge and skills either of, its own employees or, or also its clients to kind of help accelerate sustainability transformation.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to talk a bit about both. So within our own teams, we have taken a sort of a test and learn approach to sponsoring our team for different courses and trainings. And so actually, Terra is kind of one example. The Cambridge CISL course is another example. There are a few others where we have sponsored our team members. And we've done that across a breadth of the business. So like it might be a product manager, it might be a salesperson, and we find that that's a valuable investment for us to make. And I see us doing more of that in the years to come. One of the companies we look to as setting an example is Chanel, where I think the entire sustainability team was enrolled in the CISL program. And I think that's a great investment for companies to be making. If I kind of think about how we help customers with this, it is a big challenge, and we're conscious of doing the bits that we can do well effectively rather than trying to do everything. And so we've invested quite heavily in creating our own kind of content platform, which consists of events, the podcast, our newsletter, this sort of stuff. And we try and have our content, which you can access if you just Google Altruistiq and State of Sustainability, you'll come to the landing page. But we try to focus very much on practitioners' guides. And so everything that we produce is generally geared towards a sustainability practitioner in a business and is aimed at being, effectively an unbundled training program for a sustainability practitioner. We have also developed a platform called Altruistiq Academy, which we use for content and knowledge training in a more programmatic way, which means you can do a course and complete the course. I would expect we'll invest more in building that out next year and also looking at the interface between that and our State of Sustainability content platform. At the same time, I think there are other organizations innovating in the same area, like Terra, for instance, and we're always looking for ways to collaborate to make that simpler and easier and let others do what others do best and let us do what we do best, which is candidly the data side of things rather than the education front.
And I'm right in saying, the product itself is also essentially like codifying some of that knowledge. So it's reducing or making it more accessible to the user, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've also released an Ask an Advisor functionality that allows you to engage with an expert straight from within the platform. We've embedded kind of help, advice, and tips throughout the platform as well. And there's a lot more exciting functionality coming in Q1, which will help us really build on this. So I do think that in context information is going to be super useful rather than information abstracted or out of the context in which you're practicing.
And last but by no means least, in terms of the 4 pillars that we've been talking about, is role modeling. Now, obviously, as humans, we tend to align our thinking, our behavior to those of others. And, most successful transformations that we can think of harness this to create lasting change. So, for example, I think the B Corp movement does a brilliant job of this, and Altruistiq is obviously a part of that. Congratulations on your recent certification, by the way. So from your experience, what is the most effective way to build a kind of lasting cultural shift within an organization? Is it role modeling through a kind of top down or bottom up approach? Is there some other way of, propagating change?
I think the answer is slowly and consistently. And honestly, my learning has been that it's harder than you might think. I think it's not harder because it's not like the right decisions to build the right culture are difficult. The right decisions are very often obvious. I think there are two areas where I found this breaks down. Um, One is where there's a straight up conflict between what is commercially beneficial and what is the right answer from a values perspective. And there are some cases where it's a one-to-one conflict. Um, and I think that my general approach has been that when there is that conflict, values wins. At the same time, there are often gray areas. There are often gradations, like, is a delay the same as there's a lot of little sort of a lot of opportunities to fine tune that, which means that you really have to be bought into wanting to land on the values based decision. So I think that's kind of one aspect. Um, a second, I think, is around consistency. And so, Ben, I don't know if you kind of remember this from Altruistiq days, but um, we have this kudos Slack channel, and anyone can kind of actually share kudos with a colleague for something specific. So you can kind of go in there, and there's like a little Slack bot that will you can sort of say, I really want to appreciate Ben for having done an amazing job on X, right? Like Ben led this webinar. This webinar was super amazing. Lots of people engaged. Ben put in a huge amount of hard work here and really went above and beyond. And we, I think, in the first half of this year, or until the first half of this year, had a very regular cadence of lots of kudos sharing. Like it was enough that at the end of the week you could go through it. And it was a really good element of our culture, and I think really, one of many small things that helped define us. And then we started selling a lot more product, and as a result of selling a lot more product, everyone became a lot busier, which meant that individually a lot of us lost the consistency of just making that a part of our day. And that's true for me as well. And so where the role modeling comes in for me personally is you have to like be consistent about that, because it's almost like a spark, and you have to keep it alive, because once it dies, it's really difficult to reignite that. And I think that you only have so much social capital inside an organization, even if it's one that you've started, and there are only so many sparks you can reignite, if you see.
I love that. And I guess also maybe a kind of nice segue from that response, like as a kind of leader in this space, like how does Altruistiq model sustainable practices, within its own organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that for us, and it's kind of interesting in that we have to pick our bets around what do we want. It's the same advice we give to our customers, which is you kind of have to pick a few things within the broader sustainability space that you want to be really good at, and others where you kind of just want to play the game. You want to be good enough, and it's not going to be the thing that you're known for. And for us, like we're a software company with a fairly small environmental footprint. And so for us to say we're going to role model better environmental sustainability doesn't mean much, actually. So we've done all the usual things. Our cloud is a renewable energy based cloud. We kind of offset all of our own emissions at the individual level. We shifted our location from a reasonably comparatively high emitting WeWork to a much lower emitting X and Y. And so we've done a lot of things within our space. Just sorry, switching my headset. We've done a lot of things within our space that I think are the right things to do. But I wouldn't say that we're role modeling anything amazing by doing that, because these are reasonably easy things. At some point, we're going to get down to the MacBooks, and we're going to have to say, do we swap out a MacBook for something lower emissions? I'm not sure what that would be, but at that point, that's a hard change, and I'll shout about it when we've done it. But then on the other side, I think there is a lot of stuff within the social space that we can and should innovate on. And that's because actually the tech industry that we're part of has a horrible brand when it comes to most social responsibility, I think. And there's a few good examples. If you think about diversity within the workplace,
whether it's gender or ethnicity or any of the other categories, the tech industry tends to not be very good. And a lot of it actually comes from a systematic skew where you have male founders or co-founders who are typically all of the same ethnicity, or very commonly all of the same ethnicity and same age profile, same socioeconomic background. And they end up with the largest stake of the pie. And then the few joiners that they get from their networks are very similar. And so you end up with this institutionalized skew. And so the place that we need to innovate on is breaking that skew. And that's an interesting challenge. It's hard and it's interesting. But just to give a real example. So I'm a sole founder. And very much like the problem I described, the first few hires were people from within my network. And so they were all, basically men of a certain age and profile. And when we finally raised external money from VCs, we were then assigning our ESOP. And everyone who had joined Altruistiq got a cash salary and an options component on top. And we basically did it through a benchmarking. So we would kind of say, your benchmark in the market is £60,000. That's kind of what this role is worth. We're going to offer you 55,000 in cash and £7,000 in ESOP or share options equivalent, for instance. And we would systematically do the same thing with everyone we offered a job to, whether it was, man, woman, whoever. And what we found when we were then just consolidating the ESOP is that the average man at Altruistiq, not including me, had 8 times the share options of the average of anyone else on average, basically. So an 8 times skew, which was really shocking for us, not so much because it was just a massive number, but also because we thought we'd done everything right. Like we'd systematically followed the same process for everyone. There was really very little deviation in how we'd done it. And so we then ran a little analytical exercise and we tried to look into the specific, comparables. We were around 50 people, I think, at the time, or 45. And we found that even at the individual role level, when 2 people had joined at the same time, the man was typically got a significant higher number of options, even if the 2 people had the same benchmark salary. Sorry for the balloons. What it came down to was 3 things. One is that the market benchmarked men higher. Even when it was for the same role, the market just systematically benchmarked men higher. A male data engineer in the market with similar experience to a woman data engineer is paid more, basically, by the market. And so when they came into our funnel, they already had a higher salary. The second is that the men would typically take the options that they were allotted and try and negotiate it upwards. So they would either say, I'm happy to get less cash pay and I want more share options. Or they would say, look, I love the cash-based pay, but I still want more share options. So there was an element of like just systematically negotiating upwards. And the men did that most consistently. And then the third thing is that the men were also tended to be better at renegotiating the options up 6 months later or a year later based on performance. And this systematically skewed what would otherwise have been a more normal distribution. So we corrected that in the end by giving out options to try and reconcile a lot of the delta. And so we brought it down to where it was the average man had 3 times the options. And if you excluded the first 2 or 3 hires that we made, then the average man had less, basically, had fewer options than average. But that's the kind of thing I think that companies like us should be doing more of. I still don't think we're doing anywhere near enough on that sort of thing. But that's the area I think that we can innovate within the sustainability space. Sorry, Ben, that was a longer answer maybe than you were anticipating.
No, I love that example. And I also love that Altruistiq is like really trying to solve these hard problems and kind of, practice what you preach and kind of lead by example in terms of starting with the right foundation. So I would love to, ask, so in terms of like thinking about our audience today and really practitioners that are looking to accelerate, their organization's sustainability transformation journey, what kind of advice do you have for practitioners here today, based on what you've seen in the market, kind of based on what's working for your clients in the last 12 months, based on, what you think might be in store for us in 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, I think that in some ways, it's a great time to be in the industry. Like it's a great time to be in sustainability, whether you're doing that within a company, within a corporate context, or outside that. virtually across the board, right? You could be working in the nonprofit space, public sector, private sector, within the corporate space, it's across the board. I think at the same time, we are seeing some forms of retrenchment where I think that most companies are trying to consolidate around the best performing parts of the team. And so I think that the bar is going to get a little higher in terms of what you can do beyond just knowing the words and knowing the context. At the same time, you have a lot of people within the mainstream business, high performers within the mainstream business, who are now ramping up on the context. It's the flip side of what we were saying a few minutes ago, Ben, which is, those people from procurement and IT and other parts are now ramping up, and they now know they can talk the talk, and they know what's important. And this chief procurement officer I was mentioning, is not any less clued up actually than a sustainability manager in a smaller company. This person is at least as clued up, and you'll see that more and more, which means that the bar for a sustainability professional, I think, to be able to be good at other stuff is higher, to be able to be good at actually implementing stuff. And right now, if you're sending your CV to a company, I think that a year ago or 6 months ago, it was enough to say that you've been working in sustainability for 4 years and you have good credentials in other aspects, right? Degree, background, etc. And you've got a certain training program or certification or whatever. Like, I think this was a really good CV, and you could be reasonably sure that you would have a lot of jobs open to you. And a lot of people that we know within the corporate space moved around a lot because they got really great, compelling offers. Like, you were an analyst, you'd get an offer as a manager. You were a manager, you'd get an offer as like a head of a team, whatever. Like, you just could keep jumping, and you could jump to a more senior role in a similar size organization or a similar role in a larger organization relatively easily. I think that next year, a lot of that is going to diminish, potentially in pockets of the US, which is a year or two behind. It'll still be the case. But otherwise, I think we're going to see that diminish, which means that I think what you need to be able to say is that you have delivered X. And so it might be, I have successfully run a procurement process and deployed, an emissions management system or energy management system in the business. And I've, had it taken up by 80% of the company, for instance, or I have successfully deployed an emissions intervention program or a climate change program across our suppliers that had engagement from 27% of our supply chain, resulting in an emissions reduction of 4% within 8 months. Like, I think that these sort of quantifiable what you've done and what an employer can rely on you to deliver in their context is going to be quite important. And so that's the main thing that I would gear sustainability practitioners towards.
So one final question for me, and then we'll open up for some audience Q&A. So kind of looking ahead to 2024 beyond, what are your hopes for the future, and how do you see the role of employees basically engaging employees, upskilling, educating employees within organizations, kind of contributing to that vision?
Yeah, I have a bit of a fuzzy throat, so just bear with me for a moment. Sorry, Ben. So I think that what I would love to see is more lateral moves within sustainability. So I would love to see within organizations more people moving from different functions into the sustainability space. And I think that's something that we are seeing signs of, but it would be great to see more of that next year. In terms of training, I think that the quality out there is still quite variable. And I think there are a lot of relatively low quality certifications out there that don't mean much. And I think one of the problems, which is true for most of sustainability, is that there's been historically an expectation that this stuff should be free. And I think that's a problem. Like, if you think about what most knowledge partners would compete with, a lot of the times it's going to be free products and free certifications and free learning programs or stuff that's very low cost. And the same has been true for software and is now changing. I think a lot of people who subscribe to cheap or very low cost software products to measure emissions are now getting burned. And we have a few customers who have gone through multiple vendors actually, and are now with us as their third partner to work with on our space. And they've tried something for a couple of $1,000s, and then they tried something for $7,000 or $8,000, and then now they're working with us, and it's more expensive, but it's better value. And so I think we're seeing this progression towards a kind of almost like a total cost of ownership approach, which is when I think about what as a corporation, when I think about what I'm procuring from the market, and I think this is true for software and expertise and education, it's like, how much will this meaningfully add to capabilities? And so when I think about, let's say, education, if I am if we're sponsoring a salesperson to, let's say, go on, an expensive training program that actually might eat up their entire L&D budget for the year, and actually maybe even require us to advance the L&D budget for next year, I actually see a straight up payback on that for the right programs, because I'm expecting this person will now be more effective at speaking the same language to a counterpart on the other side. And that's going to deliver an upside in conversion time or win rate, for instance. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. And I'm excited just to see the education and talent space, whether it's training providers, knowledge platforms, even recruitment partners, actually start to lift the bar and solve problems to reduce the total cost of ownership of the buyer, which means just all in. If I think about what I'm spending today, time, money, etc., does this solution make my life easier, and by how much? I think that's an exciting territory to go to.
So I'm going to start. We've had a couple of questions come in. So we've got a question here from Wyatt saying, what technical innovations, either in software or data, set Altruistiq apart, and what future innovations are on the horizon for Altruistiq and the sustainability industry as a whole? Quite a big question at the end there.
Yeah, I think that the innovation that was at the heart of Altruistiq has probably been consistent, which is we've been a very data-first company. And I don't mean that just in terms of a buzzword, but we sort of prioritize data engineering very early on. And so data engineering has been a separate kind of functional capability at Altruistiq pretty much from our first year. And it was almost problematic in that we overinvested on being able to ingest data effectively from our customers and being able to conform the data from our customers' businesses into the data that we needed. And we underinvested probably on front-end functionality, at least for our first 2 years. And then we started playing catch up on that in year 3, and we'll keep innovating on that front now over the next year. But we really focused on being able to solve for messy data in customer businesses and be able to work with data across the range of structures and qualities that we find it in. So we can work with JPEGs, PNGs, PDF, structured data. We could work with data sets of 100 million lines of data. We're very flexible, which means that there's pretty much no customer that we have not been able to work with from a data perspective. And there's no customer where we haven't been able to say we could make your life 85% easier through our product, basically, just from a data gathering, cleanup, consolidation, quality perspective. And so that's probably been our single superpower that's really set us apart. And as a result of being able to solve for that, we can now solve for a bunch of other stuff. So because the data coming in is very effectively processed, it's also effectively tagged, which means we can query, filter, match, tag it to product associated with products, associated with stock keeping units, etc.
So we've got a question from Christy here, which says, in addition to going through corporate channels, do you also go directly to industrial designers and package designers and logistics?
It's a really good question, Christy. I think that what we found is that for us to be meaningful as a partner in solving climate change problems, we need to be able to have access to the data that we need. And that data does not exist in the business, and therefore we need to create it. So for us to, like we work with Kraft Heinz, for instance. And so we work with them globally and across all of their global business with 80 plus factories and 200 product brands. And so the data will not exist in that business as is. And so we need to basically process the data that they have and convert it into emissions data that we can use for us to be useful to an industrial designer or packaging designer in providing insights. Because otherwise we would just go in with outside-in assumptions where we'd say, look, like recycled glass is lower emissions than regular glass. We wouldn't be able to say, actually, in your business, there are these 3 locations where using recycled glass is viable, whereas in these other, or there's these 3 locations where switching to a hybrid furnace makes sense, versus these other locations where actually you shouldn't bother because the grid intensity isn't there yet. And so for that, we really need to be able to have access to business data so that we can give very actionable, meaningful, and granular insights.
And last question here from Remy. We often hear, about the green skills gap, but what functions do you think, need the most kind of upskilling or training on sustainability, or really just, I guess, a reflection on where do you see these gaps in the work that you're doing with your clients? And where are these kind of points of leverage almost to drive, the biggest change?
I think that there's going to be a massive need for upskilling on what we traditionally call procurement. And I think that even in the naming of it, right, like procurement is defined as being transactional. Like by its very nature, I'm procuring something from you. I'm not giving anything to you, right? I'm giving you cash for what I'm buying, but that's about it. And I think that what we're seeing is that a one-way stream is now moving to a very context-rich multi-stream engagement. What I mean by that is, we have a customer, Meadow Foods, for instance, and Meadow Foods sells dairy products to Unilever for Ben and Jerry's. And historically, the relationship will have been Meadow sells a product and Unilever defines product specifications, quality, timing, location of drop-off, and then they haggle over price and they reach some agreement. And there are some variables that they can negotiate around in trade-offs. Whereas now the dialogue is actually more nuanced, because now it's actually about how can Meadow Foods drive an emissions reduction, let's say in the products, by using their role as a buyer from farms and influencing farm behavior, for example. And in that way, they're almost acting as more of a service provider for Unilever, because they're taking ownership of part of the problem for Unilever. If Unilever owns the overall problem, Unilever can either work with those farms directly or they can go through Meadow Foods. And so Meadow Foods is effectively providing a service. The next element is whether Meadow Foods is now able to work that provision of a service into their dialogue with Unilever, so that actually it's a much more multifaceted engagement, where you maybe have data flowing both ways, you have collaboration, interventions, and ideation flowing both ways, you have money kind of probably still moving from a Unilever, but actually maybe being deployed onwards. There's a lot more happening there. And I don't think that most procurement teams, or even really any procurement teams, are set up to manage that dialogue, because the success metrics look different, look very different actually to how they have looked in the past. So given just the size of the problem that will rest within supply chains for any business, I think that being able to shift from this sort of very one-way street to this multi-dimensional mode is going to be the biggest lift.
Well, Saif, I'm afraid that is all we have time for today, but I just wanted to extend, a heartfelt thank you to you for sharing your insights and your valuable experiences with us. And, I think your journey, your expertise, you've given us a ton to, reflect on and hopefully act on as well. And for that, we're really grateful. Also, we'd just like to thank everybody who's joined. I know we've got a bunch of people dialed in on LinkedIn as well. Thank you for your participation and engagement. And we're really excited to do more events like this. As a reminder, today's session is actually part of a new series of events we're running called Climate Transformation Lab, where we're featuring change makers within organizations that are essentially leading climate transformation initiatives, and diving into education and employee engagement as part of that. And we'll be continuing with more talks like this next year, so stay tuned. And actually on January the 10th, we're testing a new format where we're going to bring a group together for kind of more of a networking style event. And the idea there is actually, in many of these conversations, we have heard that sustainability practitioners are quite isolated within their organizations, and there's a real need for community. And so we want to create a safe space where they can share challenges and help workshop solutions to each other's challenges as well. So really looking forward to that. I'm going to drop a quick link in the chat for those who are interested in signing up to that event. But yeah, without today, just want to say thank you so much again, Saif, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event, hopefully soon. And have a wonderful festive break to everyone. And yeah, thank you so much again.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. Bye.